But you're at least a Republican, so it would be good for you. Oh, you're not. Okay.
Good afternoon.
Oh, I guess
I'm John Walters, Chief Operating Officer here at Hudson Institute. Welcome to the Stern Policy Center and today's event. We are honored to be joined by a good friend of Hudson, Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas, a leader in the Senate, particularly on national security policy and today's topic concerning Chinese government's brutal suppression of the Uyghur population. Senator Cotton is an original co-sponsor of the bipartisan Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, and he has been in the forefront of numerous efforts to counter the strategic and human rights challenges posed by Beijing to the United States, our democratic allies, and the broader international community. Most of you know Senator Cotton completed one term in the House of Representatives before entering the Senate 4 years ago. He is currently serving on the Budget, Banking, Intelligence, and Armed Services Committees. He's a combat veteran of both Iraq and Afghanistan and a graduate of Harvard College, Harvard Law School, and prior to his military service in the 101st Airborne, he clerked with the U.S. Court of Appeals. In addition to all that he has done serving his country already and caring for his young family, he has written a book, and actually he's written a book, which in Washington you can't take for granted when you read a book that's got somebody's name on it. But he's written a book coming out on May 14th, Sacred Duty, A Soldier's Tour of Arlington National Cemetery. It is about the cemetery's old guard, in which he served from 2007 to 2008. I strongly recommend an Amazon pre-order so that you will have a more meaningful visit to Arlington Cemetery this Memorial Day. Please join me in welcoming Senator Cotton.
Well, thank you, John, for the very kind introduction, the very kind plug of my book as well. Thanks to Hudson Institute for inviting me to speak about China's brutality in Xinjiang province. It's always good to be back at Hudson. The Hudson Institute continues to host some of the world's most important discussions on topics of great concern to America and the world, and this event is no exception. That's because there's perhaps no greater threat to freedom today than the communist regime in Beijing. One observer described Chinese communism as a system where the average Chinese subject lives from birth to death under the eye of the state. Even when he is alone, he can never be sure that he is alone. Wherever he may be, asleep or awake, working or resting, in his bath or in his bed, he can be inspected without warning and without knowing that he is being inspected. Nothing that he does is indifferent. He has no freedom of choice in any direction, whatever. Actually, that's how George Orwell described life in Oceania in his dystopian novel, 1984. But it could just as easily describe life in China today. No one suffers the oppressive weight of Chinese communism more than the predominantly Muslim minorities of far western China, especially the Uyghurs. At least 800,000 and possibly several million Uyghurs are currently detained in a modern-day Gulag archipelago, run by a different communist power, but no less wicked, atheist, and materialist. Xinjiang province is home to just 1.5% of China's total population, but 21% of China's arrests. It would be as if 1 in 5 arrests in America happened in the state of South Carolina. By some estimates, 1 in 10 Uyghurs is currently detained. Detention quotas for some provinces are higher still, at around 40% of the total population. Residents who've so far been spared these concentration camps are nonetheless subjected to Orwellian security and assaults on their privacy, religious faith, and way of life. The Chinese government is spending tens of billions of dollars on facial recognition, electronic spying, and coercive DNA collection to create a database capable of tracking a person's every move. That's the very definition of a totalitarian system, one that exercises total control over the person, down to the very strands of your DNA. I'm a member of the Congressional Executive Commission on China, a body charged with monitoring political and human rights conditions in that country. In the course of that work, the Commission often hears stories of men and women persecuted by the Chinese state. Last November, the Commission heard the testimony of a brave Uyghur woman and the mother of triplets, Mirgul Tursun. After living abroad for some years, Mirgul returned to Xinjiang with her 3 infant children in 2015. What awaited her was a nightmare. Almost immediately, Mirgul was separated from her children and detained, seemingly for no reason. When she asked what crime she'd committed, she received a telling reply: "You being a Uyghur is a crime," much like Oceania's terrible face crime. Mirgul described the horrendous conditions she and her fellow Uyghurs were subjected to in the re-education camps. By her account, 9 of her 68 cellmates died within the span of 3 months. They were starved, confined in tight spaces, injected with unknown drugs, and electrocuted, all while being forced to sing patriotic Chinese songs and repeat slogans like "Long live Xi Jinping," not unlike the Ministry of Love's indoctrination of Big Brother. In other words, they were being brainwashed, a term, I'll note, that originated with the Chinese communists during the Korean War. Eventually, Mirgul was released from captivity, but only after filming a videotaped oath where she was forced to lie that the police never interrogated her, never tortured her, never even detained her. Her captors sent her imprisonment and torture down the memory hole. Mirgul survived her treatment at the hands of the Chinese government, but her children were not so lucky. One died. The others suffer health problems to this day. What was left of the Tursun family fled to America, where the Chinese government continues to harass them right here on American sovereign soil, just as it harasses other Uyghurs who have defected to the free world. Beijing's crimes against a tiny minority in a remote land may seem excessive, but also distant from our concerns. Yet Xinjiang holds great cultural, strategic, and ideological significance for the Chinese Communist Party. So it's critical to understand the regime's motives and plans to see why it matters to all of us. Han-dominated China has always felt a deep insecurity and even fear about its western hinterlands, Tibet and Xinjiang. Indeed, the word Xinjiang in Mandarin actually means new dominion. And that's precisely how China sees it, as a new land to be dominated. China sees its giant western provinces as a critical buffer against rival powers. China also uses these provinces as a staging ground to project military and economic power into the heart of Eurasia. So ever since Mao took over the country in 1949, the regime has done everything it can to bring these territories to heel, not least by overwhelming and erasing the native minorities through population transfers. The regime has relocated millions of Han Chinese to Xinjiang and Tibet. Much like China's campaign of artificial island building in the South China Sea, its demographic transformation of the West is a way to create new facts on the ground. Today, the population of Xinjiang is about evenly split between Han Chinese and native minorities, but it may not remain that way for long. Of course, the plight of the Tibetan people has been well publicized for decades. It's a cause célèbre in Washington and Hollywood. Political leaders like Nancy Pelosi have met with the Dalai Lama, the face of Tibetan resistance and culture. Celebrities like Brad Pitt and Harrison Ford have even been banned from China for their outspoken criticism. I commend Speaker Pelosi and these citizens for speaking out against Chinese oppression in Tibet. Now it's time to shine the spotlight on Xinjiang, which is directly to Tibet's north and is being persecuted for many of the same reasons. The most important reasons for China's clampdown are strategic. Xinjiang is the largest province in China and also the richest in energy. 1/4 to 1/3 of China's petroleum deposits lie in Xinjiang, as well as an abundance of natural gas and coal. As important, Xinjiang is located strategically at the crossroads of Asia, giving China access to Central Asia and the Middle East, including Afghanistan. China has been aggressively courting all of the countries along its western border as part of its Belt and Road Initiative. Already, Chinese railways and energy pipelines are snaking across Central Asia. Xinjiang is the gateway to the Eurasian empire that China hopes to build. Paradoxically, Western regions like Xinjiang are also important to China's aspirations on its eastern shores. China seeks total control over its own Western territory so that it can project power and create a sphere of influence throughout the Asia-Pacific region and ultimately the world. This is another reason we must care about the fate of Xinjiang. China's repression at home enables aggression abroad against America and our allies. Nor will China's totalitarian methods stay safely in distant provinces in Central Asia. To the contrary, China views its so-called smart cities and re-education camps as models for export. Already there have been reports of U.S. lawful permanent residents detained in Xinjiang's internment camps. Police task forces from Hong Kong have visited Xinjiang to study its methods of social control. And despots around the world, from Vladimir Putin to the Ayatollahs, are surely watching this experiment with great interest. What started in the remote steppes of Central Asia may soon come to the coast and eventually to a city near you. The strategic and cultural significance of Xinjiang gives us an idea of why China is turning the province into a police state and why it demands America's full attention. As for the particular methods China is using, there's a strong ideological component at play. Since the massacre at Tiananmen Square in 1989, it has been obsessed with what it calls ideological security against so-called false trends like democracy. It's also fiercely concerned with what it calls splitism, separatist movements that arise within cultural and ethnic groups such as the majority Muslim Uyghurs. The Chinese Communist Party believes the way to guard against such threats is to purge them ruthlessly from the minds of its subjects. And that's precisely what we're observing in Xinjiang, where the Chinese government is steamrolling any sign of cultural, linguistic, and religious diversity and attempting to replace it with the deadening uniformity of communism. Thought crime must be purged. Xinjiang believes he has the world to gain from the new Silk Road he's building across Eurasia. But he fears China won't be able to control its empire if its minorities hold to their religious beliefs and traditional cultures. So Xi has decided to take no chances by eradicating those inconvenient artifacts of humanity. Not only for the Uyghurs then, but also for our own security, China must face consequences for its crimes in Xinjiang. We ought to use the Magnitsky Act to impose sanctions on Communist Party officials who are orchestrating these crimes, especially Chen Chuan-Guo, the Politburo slave master of Tibet and Xinjiang. We also ought to sanction companies that are manufacturing China's instruments of repression, such as the state-controlled surveillance camera companies Hikvision and Dahua Technologies. Just like their more famous telecom cousins, Huawei and ZTE, these companies are puppets of the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army, and we ought to deny them access to Western markets. Additionally, we must stop our own companies from helping China build this new evil empire. Companies like Thermo Fisher Scientific, which sells the DNA sequencers China uses to build genetic dossiers on its ethnic minorities. This is the 21st century rope that capitalists will sell to hang themselves. And it ought to be a lesson to companies like Google, which is performing cutting-edge artificial intelligence research in China and contemplating even greater investment in that country. Many of these measures are recommended in a bill I'm sponsoring, the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act. Congress ought to pass this bill. And we should all raise our voices and ensure the civilized world knows what China is doing in Xinjiang, where the ugly truth of communism is once again laid bare for all to see. That's why I'm pleased this event is taking place. If any country is equipped to speak out about China's totalitarian crimes, it's ours, the land of the free. So we must speak out, often and loud. Today, the Chinese government is purging every vestige of its subjects' freedoms at home to pave the way for its economic, military, and political expansion abroad. China has a plan for the world, and it's as concrete as the prison cells where it keeps its dissenters. Make no mistake, the brutal police tactics in Xinjiang are not just an assault on that province's native people, although they are surely that. They're also an assault on the American-led world order and a disturbing premonition of an alternative world order, one controlled by the Chinese Communist Party and one that ends in room 101. 1984 may be 35 years in the past now, but for China, 1984 is always the future. Thank you all very much.
Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you to Senator Cotton for his leadership on this issue. I'm very happy to convene this panel. One of our speakers, Ambassador Curry, has been waylaid. I hope that she'll be able to join us in a few minutes as she makes her way over here. We started our series, here she is, in fact, Ambassador Curry. We'll get you a microphone in a moment. Thanks for being here. We started our series of panels here at the Institute on the emergency in Xinjiang about 2 years ago to draw more policy attention here in the US to the Chinese Communist Party's intensifying repression of the Uyghurs and others in the region. Since then, Xinjiang, as Senator Cotton had described, has become the most heavily garrisoned part of the PRC and a living Orwellian nightmare for the people who live there. As many as 1 million and probably many more Uyghurs have been detained in re-education camps while the Communist Party has been busy perfecting or attempting to perfect the world's most technologically advanced surveillance state. As Dolkan Issa and many others here today have tirelessly reminded all of us, the high-tech industrial scale of communist methods in Xinjiang may be new, but the intent behind it and the sources of PRC's conduct are not. The party's harsh treatment of Uyghurs and its bid to erase Uyghur Muslim and Turkic culture go back to the 1950s, when Maoist forces had annexed Xinjiang, making it a part of the newly formed Chinese Communist Empire. Now PRC is more powerful. Total control of Xinjiang has become essential to the Belt and Road Initiative and Beijing's strategic bid to give Eurasia and the world at large a new operating system, one that favors authoritarian powers and makes Greater Asia a safer place for the Communist Party to preserve its monopoly of power at home. The Uyghurs' plight offers us a cautionary lesson for what these ambitions may mean for the future of human rights and democratic norms and other populations who don't have governments that can protect them from PRC's excesses. We're here today to discuss recent developments in Xinjiang, where the crisis may be headed, and what liberal societies and others of good conscience might do to challenge the Communist Party over its egregious policies and actions. We also want to discuss the external ramifications of the PRC's total empire in Xinjiang. Indeed, the Communist Party touts its technologically enabled police state as a sort of model for other countries and for aspiring authoritarians elsewhere. This obviously has far-reaching ramifications for the new long argument that is now unfolding between open societies and the resurgent forces of authoritarianism around the world. I'm especially honored to be joined by all of our panelists today who have come in many cases from very far away and have run tremendous bureaucratic traps to be with us as well. Our first speaker is going to be Dolkan Issa, who joins us from Munich, where he is the president of the World Uyghur Congress, which has advocated for years for the rights of Uyghurs in Xinjiang and abroad to use and also to use peaceful and democratic means for Uyghurs to determine their future. Our second speaker will be Ambassador Kelly E. Curry, who is right now serving as the U.S. representative to the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations. Ambassador Curry is extremely well regarded around town. I'm delighted that she's here. She specializes in a range of issues: political reform, development, and human rights in the Asia Pacific. And her leadership at the UN has been incredibly important on the Xinjiang crisis. Our third speaker will be Dr. Ryan Thum, who's a senior research fellow at the University of Nottingham. He's written a terrific book, which I recommend to all of you, called The Sacred Routes of Uyghur History. It's a historical work, but it involved an enormous amount of ethnographic field research in Xinjiang and in other places in China, and he is one of the leading experts on the situation in Xinjiang today. And finally, to speak about the external ramifications of the PRC police state, which is a subject that we've done a lot of work on here at Hudson Institute, we'll have Dr. David Schulman, who is currently a senior advisor at the International Republican Institute, where he oversees IRI's work addressing the influence of PRC and other autocracies on democratic governance globally. Dave had previously served as an East Asian analyst in the US government for nearly a dozen years, and most recently served as our Deputy National Intelligence Officer for East Asia at the National Intelligence Council. So with that, thank you all again for being here, and we'll each have about 10 minutes perhaps to speak, and we'll begin with Dolkan. Thank you, Dolkan,
Thank you.
for being here.
Hello, good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Hudson Institute and Eric invited me to speak here today. It is my honor to be here, and particularly with the same panel, Ambassador Kerry. She did very excellent job and showed support to my participation in United Nations meeting last year in New York. So I would like to use this opportunity. I would like to express my deep appreciation to you. Thank you. The date of this event consists with very sad anniversary of the Uyghurs. Actually, yesterday, 5th of February is 22nd anniversary of the Gulja massacre, which was happening in 1997, 5th February in Gulja area, East Turkestan. So, and the peaceful demonstration among them Uyghur youth cracked down by the Chinese security forces. According to the Amnesty International report, more than 100 people were killed, around 400 Uyghur youth were injured, and thousands Uyghur were arrested. And according to the international and international Amnesty International and the other research centers saying later time is more than two, because of this participation of this demonstration, 200 Uyghur youths were death sentenced. Since then, we have witnessed several protest uprising by the Uyghurs and ongoing crackdown by the Chinese authority since 1997. The situation now is worse it has been in my lifetime. Particularly in the past 5 years, we have witnessed a strategy of the Chinese government shift to unapologetic cultural assimilation and the social re-engineering of the Uyghur people, particularly Xi Jinping, after Xi Jinping took the power. Everything that makes the Uyghur people unique, or language, religious, cultural, has been targeted. I don't speak much current situation today. Today is Senator Khatun. He explained very well what is going on today in Turkistan. I talk a little bit in the past, because repression and the problem of the Uyghur is not new. It has been done for many years. There is one policy of Chinese Communist Party towards the Uyghurs has never been changed. It is the assimilation policy. Sometimes Chinese government implemented this policy used with a brutal way and crackdown, and sometimes implemented is with makeup. But this policy has never changed. During the Cultural Revolution time, before the Cultural Revolution, after the Cultural Revolution, even today, Chinese government and continually implement this assimilation policy and the population transport to this area. 1949, when the Chinese Communist Army occupied Turkestan, that time only 3 to 4% Uyghur Chinese population holds region. Today is official number more than 42%. And different of period of time, Chinese government labeled the Uyghurs different of kind of label. Before the September 11, Chinese government labeled all the Uyghur activities separatism, religious fundamentalism, something like. But after September 11 terrorist attack in New York, and the Chinese government immediately changed position and changed language, blame the terrorist activities. But however, just 1 month before the September 11 terrorist attack, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson made a statement very clearly: Xinjiang is a very peaceful place, so all the foreign investor can make investment here. Very peaceful. Just 2 weeks before the September 11, governor of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, he made a statement: Xinjiang is a very peaceful place, you are welcome. But after 2 weeks later, everything has changed, and after one night, we being a terrorist. 2003, Chinese government official announced 11 people and 4 Uyghur organizations as a terrorist organization. I was one of them. I'm the number 3 terrorist of the Chinese list. And yes, and the World Uyghur Youth Congress, a German-based organization, as a terrorist organization. But in the whole life, I have never seen a real bomb or real gun in my life. I have just seen on the movie. But I'm still on the top terrorist, and I was suffering 21 years because of the red notes by the Interpol. Fortunately, last year, February, or exactly 1 year before, my red notes was deleted by the Interpol. And after the Mao died, 1970s, end of 1970 and until 1980s, there is a 10 years, little bit situation was better if you compare today's, and a little bit freedom of expression, freedom of religious. If you look back 1980s, situation much better today than today. In 1985 and 1988, we have two big student demonstration was happening in Xinjiang University. I was one of some leader of the student demonstration that time. The Russian Abbas, she's here. She was the my vice president that time. And well, that time we hold the demonstration. We demand the Chinese government democratic election, stop nuclear testing, population transport. That time we had little bit chance to talk to the Chinese government. I personally had 6 hours debate with a high-level Chinese official. Well, it was 1980, 30 years ago. But 1997, after the when the Xinjiang massacre was happening, and then 2009, 10 years before, this year is the 10 years anniversary of 5th of July massacre. We will commemorate 10 years anniversary soon, is July 5th. It is the same demonstration, but it result is a big different. So 1997, at least 100 people were killed. 2009, 10 years ago, and according to the Chinese official statistic, 197 people were killed. But unofficially, since the 10 years, hundreds of eyewitness escaped to the Europe, United States, some other country. They reported more than 1,000 people were killed one night. It is the big difference, yes. Today, situation is unimaginable, and no single Uyghur felt safe. Doesn't matter. She or he is the high-level official of the Communist Party, or it is businessman or teacher, student, singer, sportsman. Because of the ethnicity, if she or he is the Uyghur, it is not safe today. I can tell my personal story, as you may know, and some of them my mother, 78 years old, all the leaders, all the ladies, she was arrested 2017, May or June, exact time I don't know, because I have lost contact more than 22 months with my family. Last telephone communication, my family is middle of April 2017. Since then, I have lost contact. Then I learned international media, my father passed away in the camps. 2018, 17th of May, my mother passed away in the camp. My younger brother is Isa. She disappeared since March or April 2017, more than 2 years. She was disappeared. My older brother, he was a professor, one of the colleges in my hometown. He was detained as well. When I was in Japan, Tokyo, I learned one of his neighbors study in Japan. He told me, your brother sentenced 20 years. What reason, I have no idea. And my father is 90 years old, guys, but I have no idea. Today is 21st century. Communication is not the issue at all, but it is a big issue for us today. Even I have no idea. My father is still alive or died. It is a very painful situation. This story is not, my story is not unique. However, most Uyghur family have similar stories. Most of the Uyghur are feeling hopeless even today, and the Uyghurs who living in the United States, Europe, Turkey, around the world, they have the same problem. They haven't got any contact with the family member since the 2017 April. Well, actually, China has trying not only persecuted the Uyghur inside East Turkestan, also expanded his targeting to outside the country. China today has trying his economic card, use the economic card and trying to monopolize international system, particularly United Nations human rights system, and also trying to influence a European Parliament everywhere. Just 2 weeks ago, beginning of maybe 3 weeks ago, I was in the European Parliament. I had a meeting several MEPs there. I just tell you one example, how China is trying to monopolize stop to activities around the world. One of the parliament member, he promised a lot. We explained the situation in East Turkestan. He was shown very sympathized. He's saying, okay, we will do this. He promised some action, but after 2 weeks later, he called us to meet again because Chinese embassy called his home called his wife, saying to have a meeting. He was very worried. Then, and the Chinese ambassador want to get appointment with this MEP, this parliament member. After meeting, this parliament member is a U-turn, immediately saying, Dolkun, sorry, I cannot take this initiative because I'm really worried on my family situation. After my family got the telephone calling by the Chinese embassy, then I cannot do it. Continue. I sympathize, but I cannot do it. It is the reality today, you know. So I'm really thanks for the Senator Cotton, and in the world, I still believe have a brave congressman, Senator Rivia. So, and the Chinese government also continued trying to monopolize the UN system. I was kicked out the UN in New York, 2017. I have had the accreditation everywhere, everything, but China used its power. And also Chinese government and calling to the Uyghur community in the United States around the world, and they make a threat. Today, a lot of Uyghurs who live in Western country feel not safety, not face safety. However, in the last few months, we have given some given reason to the hope. Finally, international community seems to be waking up. In the UN, in the August, United Nations Committee elimination all racial discrimination and review the Chinese report. Then is a turning point. And after that, and the UN expert and several countries speak out on the Uyghur, particularly the concentration camp issue. And the UN working group enforce involuntary disappearance also contacts the Chinese government. High Commissioner of for the Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, also asks the Chinese government send some independent investigation to the camps. And UPR on China, Universal Periodic Review on China, was particularly a critical moment. More than 14 countries raised this issue, and strong made a statement asking Chinese government close down this camp. And the European Union also speak out on this camp issue. And the European External Service also raises camp during the European Union and the Chinese Human Rights Dialogue time. Germany, UK, and also a parliament, UK Parliament, German Parliament, Canadian Parliament was having several debate on this issue. Particularly in the US, we have seen a lot of support for the US Congress, US State Department, Vice President and Pence and Pompeo, and also US Senator Marco Rubio and Congressman Chris Smith really concerned on this issue and speak out loudly. It is bringing more moral support to the Uyghur people, because today it is, if the Uyghur people lost hope, then everything will be happen. Today, Uyghur people really need the moral support. In December, 15 states led by Canadian ambassador in Beijing sent a letter to the Chinese government to request a meeting with Xinjiang, but Chinese government denied it. But unfortunately, and the Muslim country were silent. But we are trying to doing some advocacy in Muslim country as well. Recently, just the beginning of the January, one delegation from the World Uyghur Congress or Executive Chairman Ömer Kanat and the Ilshat Esen visit Malaysia and in Indonesia. They had very high-level official meeting with Malaysia and Indonesia. Now, and we have seen recently civil society and speak out. And some Muslim country also slowly is wake up. For example, Kuwait, several MEP parliament members also speak out Kuwait parliament recently. It is the hope, and we had also meeting Islamic Cooperation Organization. Well, civil society also very active, and just the Monday, 2 days ago, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, International Service on the Human Rights, and the World Uyghur Congress jointly organized a press conference in Geneva call United Nations Human Rights Council adopt urgent resolution and send some fact-finding mission to the China and to the Eastern Turkestan. Well, all these things was happening, but yes, today is, as I say, several countries, civil society, United Nations and the United States, and concerning this issue, but Chinese government never stopped it. As we see the satellite image, continue expanded this camps. So it is a time really take some action. So just the concern issue is not good enough. So just
could we come back to that?
Okay.
After
Okay.
what more needs to be done? That really is a crucial.
Okay, just last sentence. So, and why really we need, it is a time to and the whole world, particularly United States, and take action, lead, and shows it is leadership position to the other world. And I think it is a time tomorrow to be late. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tolkien, really, for being here. Ambassador Curry.
Thank you, and I apologize for running a little bit late. I believe there are about 80 foreign ministers at the State Department right now, so getting in and out of the building is a bit trying today. But thank you so much for having me here today to speak on this really important topic at this crucial time. It's an honor for me to be on this panel with so many esteemed experts, but especially with my friend Dolken, who's struggled just to visit the United Nations, just to participate in non-governmental activities at the United Nations is a testament to how China has perverted and intimidated the international institutions that are supposed to serve to protect and promote human rights. I'm really pleased to be able to share that panel with him today and reaffirm our ongoing support for the work of human rights defenders like Dolken and all of those who are fighting to bring abuses to light and to protect the voiceless. The United States remains deeply disturbed and alarmed that in the past 2 years alone, the Chinese government has detained an estimated 800,000 to possibly 2 million Uyghurs, ethnic Kazakhs, and other Muslims in internment camps. As my former boss, Ambassador Nikki Haley, noted, this is the largest internment of civilians in the world today. Last year, when disturbing information about the situation in Xinjiang started to come to light, the initial Chinese response to this was denial. In recent months, as proof of massive internment camps, satellite images, procurement orders for torture implements, and survivor testimonies have emerged, China's international image has been damaged, and as a result, they've changed their tactics. In the months since the UN Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination and the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Organization of the Islamic Conference, all of these organizations have spoken out recently about the situation in Xinjiang. The Chinese have mounted a massive damage control effort that is aimed at incorporating narratives that they hope will convince the world that they haven't essentially declared war on their own Muslim minority. This effort has featured staged tours of re-education camps for diplomats from recently 12 mostly Muslim majority countries and another one for EU observers recently. And while we've heard that these stage-managed visits have left visitors unconvinced, there remains within the international community, as Dolken noted, an unfortunate willingness to suspend disbelief and accept some of China's implausible explanations for what's happening in Xinjiang today. So I thought I would use this opportunity to address some of the myths that the Chinese state has been peddling about the situation in Xinjiang, especially in the past 6 months. Myth number one that they frequently use is that these are vocational training centers. And I know it is laughable, but it's certainly not credible. But the Chinese have consistently since about September, claimed that this network of massive barbed wire surrounded internment camps in Xinjiang are humane job training centers. These claims are obviously undermined by reports of brutal conditions in the camps and survivor testimonies, as well as by satellite imagery of the camps that reveal structures resembling prisons more than schools, and by the Chinese government's own procurement documents that call for barbed wire, batons, and other materials that are more suitable to prisons than schools. New evidence from commercial satellite imagery and official Chinese contracts indicate that large new camps are still being built, and reports of a system of forced labor are emerging from these camps. Former detainees have spoken of relentless indoctrination and harsh conditions. They report mandatory classes where detainees are required to recite communist slogans, sing songs praising the Communist Party and President Xi Jinping, and disavow their own cultural and religious beliefs. Failure to quickly learn these lessons leads to beatings, food deprivation, and sometimes formal prosecution on amorphous criminal charges. There are reports of the use of stress positions, cold cells, and sleep deprivation in the camps. We've also seen reports of other forms of torture or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, including sexual abuse. Xinjiang's most prominent Uyghur intellectuals, some of whom once held party-vetted positions in top educational institutions or have studied and taught at top universities around the world, are among the targets of these vocational education centers. Why would internationally regarded professors with advanced degrees and other intellectuals need vocational training? Why would families be denied information about the whereabouts of their family members, their well-being, or for how long they will be held if they were simply attending vocational training programs? If these are vocational training centers, why are they surrounded by barbed wire? Why is the security sector so intimately involved in their construction and management? These are interesting questions. Myth number 2, Xinjiang's camps are an effective approach to fighting terrorism and extremism. Chinese authorities have alternatively claimed that what they are doing is no different from what Western countries are doing to fight terrorism and extremism, or they claim that they've discovered some new magical formula for effectively fighting terrorism through these camps and the assorted repressive policies that they employ outside of them. But history has shown that repressive policies and mass detention of the type that China is pursuing today in Xinjiang are more likely to spur rather than deter terrorism. In reality, China's brutal tactics are self-fulfilling. They are creating the very radicalism and violence that they claim to be tamping down. Rather than seeking to protect China from the threat of terrorism, Xinjiang's camps appear to be focused on trying to diminish the ethnic identity, religious belief, and nonviolent cultural and religious practices of their detainees. Reports from former detainees describe how detainees are forced to renounce Islam and their Uyghur identity and embrace the Chinese Communist Party and President Xi Jinping personally. For example, praying and using common Muslim greetings are forbidden in the camps. There are reports that authorities continually surveil detainees to prevent them from praying even in their own beds in the middle of the night. Detainees are reportedly forced to eat pork and drink alcohol in violation of their religious beliefs. Women are forced to cut their hair and men to shave their beards. Some have reported being forcibly medicated with unknown substances. These tactics can only serve to further alienate the Uyghur people from the Chinese state and the majority Han ethnicity. We have consistently urged China to reverse its counterproductive policies that conflate terrorism and extremism with the peaceful expression of cultural identity, religious beliefs, and political views. Myth number 3, that Xinjiang residents enjoy, as Dolkan was saying, a peaceful life as a result of the Chinese government's ethnic and religious policies. As horrific as the situation inside the camps is, life in Xinjiang outside the camps is not much better for everyday people. The Chinese government in Xinjiang is engaged in an Orwellian effort to monitor every aspect of Uyghur life and members of other Muslim minority communities. They are not particularly subtle about it either. The pervasive surveillance system in place across Xinjiang today has been described as an open-air prison. Checkpoints restrict access to neighborhoods, and there are security cameras everywhere, including in mosques pointing at both the congregation and the imam. At the same time, thousands of mosques have been shuttered or destroyed. Uyghurs are singled out for constant police checks of their phones and their identifications, while non-Uyghurs are left alone to go about their business. Uyghurs are not allowed to engage in traditional cultural practices, including burials and other ceremonies. The authorities have been collecting massive amounts of data, personal data, including DNA samples, often involuntarily, from Uyghurs as part of this pervasive surveillance effort. Even in their homes, Uyghurs cannot escape this intense monitoring. Thousands of Uyghur families have been forced to accept outsiders sent by the state into their homes for extended home stays. These Communist Party cadre are sent into Uyghur homes, calling themselves aunties or uncles, and claiming to be there to help them become modern Chinese people. But their real purpose appears to be reporting on families and driving a wedge between generations. Speaking the Uyghur language at home is reportedly cause for being sent to an internment camp. Children are not permitted to attend any form of religious instruction or education and are restricted from mosque attendance. Children have been removed from their homes and sent to boarding schools or orphanages, even when they still have a parent at home. For Uyghurs, even physically fleeing China is not enough to escape the long arm of the Chinese Communist Party, as Dolken has said. China routinely pressures other countries to return Uyghurs, many of whom are seeking asylum. Most Uyghurs involuntarily returned to China face arbitrary imprisonment, disappearance, torture, or even summary execution. Uyghurs living abroad have reported that their families have either cut off contact under the threat of the Chinese state, or their families are leveraged to compel them to return to China. In some cases, most recently in Malaysia, we've been able to work with foreign governments and support them in resisting Chinese pressure to return people. But even when Uyghurs, ethnic Kazakhs, and other Muslim minorities fleeing Chinese repression find safety abroad, Chinese security services and their proxies continue to harass and intimidate them and their family members abroad or back in China. Uyghurs worldwide report being contacted by police and ordered to return to China for no reason. They've also exploited international law enforcement cooperations, as Dolken was discussing with regard to his run-in with Interpol. We were glad that Interpol finally rescinded its falsely put on him red notice last year. It was a real abomination. But in the process of getting that removed, Dolken was repeatedly harassed around the world because of this red notice. And while the focus is often on Uyghurs, it's not just them. Ethnic Kazakhs have talked about their experiences in the camps, and we also see that Kyrgyz, Uzbeks, Hui Muslims, Tibetans, and Christians have been put through similar circumstances. Many of the repressive techniques that we are seeing in Xinjiang have migrated from Tibet, and were first used there. And now we're seeing that some of these repressive techniques are migrating from Xinjiang to the Hui Autonomous Region and other parts of China, including in Yunnan province. So this breathtaking social engineering process that's underway across Xinjiang and other parts of China can best be understood by listening to the words of Chinese officials. In one particularly chilling, but by no means unique example, the Chinese ambassador to the United States, Shui Changkai, was quoted in a November interview with Reuters saying that while the United States was using bombs and drones to go after terrorists, quote, "We Chinese are trying to re-educate most of them, trying to turn them into normal persons who can go back to normal life." In one brief sentence, Shui Changkai crudely demonstrated the horrifying mentality that underpins China's policies in Xinjiang. The party state presumes that all Uyghurs and Muslims are terrorists until proven otherwise, and that being a Uyghur or Muslim is abnormal. Myth number 4. The United States and the international community are not speaking out in the face of China's abuses. The Trump administration has led the international efforts to prevent China from undermining the international human rights system and the norms underpinning it, of which the situation in Xinjiang is the most egregious, but by far not the only example. We have called on foreign governments to join us in this cause. We are working hard to build a broader coalition of like-minded states. Ambassador Haley has spoken publicly about the situation in Xinjiang, including during the International Religious Freedom Ministerial last year and during a recent speech to the Chiefs of Defense Conference. I've personally raised the issue at the UN, both directly with Chinese counterparts and in multilateral fora. In November, the United States and more than a dozen other countries expressed our alarm at the Chinese government's worsening crackdown on Uyghurs, ethnic Kazakhs, and other members of Muslim minority groups in Xinjiang at the Universal Periodic Review, UPR, of China. In addition to these multilateral efforts, we're also working with our allies to ensure that the United States is not alone in speaking out. Canada, the EU, Australia, Japan, and other governments have condemned the situation in Xinjiang. Many of their parliaments, like the US Congress, have likewise facilitated public debates on Xinjiang and urged policymakers to take action to address these abuses. We are working with a number of like-minded majority Muslim countries as well to engage them and encourage them to stand up for the basic rights of their co-religionists in China. We are also directly raising this issue with our Chinese interlocutors at the highest levels. Secretary Pompeo spoke about this issue in no uncertain terms alongside his Chinese counterpart at the Diplomatic and Security Dialogue in Washington, D.C. last October. The Secretary underscored that, quote, the United States is unequivocal when it comes to human rights, and urged the Chinese government to treat its people with the respect and dignity that every human being is entitled to. Vice President Pence has also spoken out clearly on the abuse of the abuse of Muslims and other minorities here at the Hudson Institute. And we're doing more than speaking out. The administration's also developing a whole-of-government strategy to address the campaign of repression in Xinjiang. Elements of this strategy could include using a number of tools to promote accountability of Chinese officials for human rights abuses, efforts to prevent China's use of U.S. goods and services to perpetrate its egregious activities in Xinjiang, and strengthening our diplomatic and public diplomacy efforts throughout the world, not just here at home and in the West. The State Department, as part of an interagency effort, has conducted outreach to U.S. and Chinese companies with business in Xinjiang to encourage them to undertake human rights due diligence and safeguards in efforts to ensure their commercial activities don't contribute to China's human rights violations. The State Department has also met with members of the Uyghur diaspora and coordinates with U.S. law enforcement agencies to address the harassment of Uyghurs here in the United States. In response to the conditions in Xinjiang, we've seen a growth in the number of asylum seekers from Xinjiang seeking refuge outside of China for fear of persecution, torture, or worse. U.S. embassies are providing assistance to survivors of Xinjiang's camps. In addition to consistently urging them to join us in pressing China to end its campaign of repression, the department has engaged dozens of foreign governments to successfully prevent the refoulement of dozens of Uyghurs and other members of Muslim minority groups whose lives or freedoms would be threatened on account of their religion, or where there are substantial grounds to believe they are in danger of being subjected to torture. In conclusion, I want to make clear that we will continue to call on China to end these counterproductive and abusive policies, free all of those arbitrarily detained, and cease coercion of members of its Muslim minority. Forcing China to confront and defend its repressive policies is an important first step. But if we are to fundamentally change China's behavior in Xinjiang, the international community must act together. In order to limit or halt China's campaign, we need united global action, including and especially from Muslim majority countries, to promote accountability for those who commit human rights violations and abuses in Xinjiang and elsewhere. Thank you again for giving me this opportunity, and I look forward to the discussion and answering questions, talking more about what we can do to build that coalition. Thank you.
Many thanks, Kelly, for that and for everything that you do. Ryan.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for inviting me to join this panel. It's a pleasure to be on the same panel with such powerful voices on this issue, and a pleasure in particular to come after Ambassador Curry's very sober and efficient run-through of what's going on in Xinjiang, which very well accords with what the academic community thinks is going on there. What I want to do is talk a little bit about new developments in the last 4 months or 5 months or so, and what they can tell us about the general direction of China's policy of mass internment and cultural cleansing. And then, since this is a policy oriented venue, make a couple of recommendations or comments based on that. So let me just run through a few important things. One is, it was already mentioned, the Becoming Family program, which we already knew about. This is the program by which over 1 million members of the Han Chinese ethnic majority have been sent into Uyghur kitchens, living rooms, and even bedrooms to officially to promote ethnic unity, but also according to the handbooks they're given to monitor the thoughts, actions, and loyalties of the people who are forced to host them. This has become, the scale of this has become more widely known recently through the Chinese government's own proclamations and through the ethnographic work of Darren Byler at the University of Washington. Another thing that I think has been an important development was the October appearance of legislation at the regional level, which mentioned the internment camps. Now, it did not provide any legal system by which humans could be put into the camps, but it did mention the construction of a camp system, thereby not necessarily legalizing the system, but giving it an identity in Chinese law. We saw shortly thereafter a massive investment in propaganda aimed at the outside world. This comprised both the alteration and dressing up of kind of Potemkin village model camps and videos shot in these model altered camps and distributed worldwide, and also the diplomatic tours that Ambassador Curry mentioned. We've seen more recently study tours for security officials from other parts of China. So Hong Kong security officials were sent to Xinjiang to learn from security officials there. Officials from Ningxia, Muslim special Hui Muslim region has been sent there. We've seen in the end of December very limited number of releases, which we became aware of through the Uyghur diaspora. This is maybe on the order of hundreds, maybe over 1,000, generally elderly people who are released from the camps into house arrest. And I think this is important because I think we should see occasional releases as a part of the system and as a part of the entrenchment and institutionalization and regularization of this system. Alongside that, we've seen the rise or the revelation of large-scale forced labor that is associated with the camps, sometimes presented as something that's a normal part of the camps and sometimes presented as a stage in a sort of easier treatment where once you reach some level of loyalty and learning within the indoctrination system, you are moved into part-time or full-time factory work, sometimes connected to the camp. And last, the shipping of prisoners to the interior. The number of credible reports has been growing steadily of thousands, tens of thousands, most likely, of Uyghurs who are shipped under cover of darkness and with great secrecy from Xinjiang to other parts of China. What I think most of these have in common, perhaps excepting the Becoming Family program, is that they suggest an entrenchment of the system, a formalization, entry of the system into explicit discussion at a formal level, and the entanglement of Xinjiang's internment camp system with institutions in the rest of China. And as Ambassador Curry mentioned, this has gone on alongside the continued construction of camps. The lesson I take from this is that the outcry from the US, Canada, and Europe has not made much of an effect on the decision-making of the Chinese government so far. And the US, in fact, has been a leader in that outcry. Although I have to say, for the most part, what we've seen are words and not actions. The Chinese state doesn't seem to be too concerned about those actions. If they were, I would expect them to at least be lying and say we intend to dismantle this soon. They haven't even gone that far, much less taken any concrete actions. So where have we seen any kind of reaction that suggests concern from the decision makers who insist on perpetuating this system? The one place I see concern is in their targeting of which kind of diplomats they have brought on the tours of the camps. And those have, until the recent tour for European ministers, those have been representatives of countries in the global south, countries particularly in Asia, and for the most part, Muslim majority countries. This seems to be where the Chinese state is concerned. So let's look at these two things together and make some hypotheses. I think what we see when we see the entrenchment combined with the focus on these countries from the global south is that if change is going to be made, it's going to have to be, as Ambassador Curry said, it's going to have to be part of a unified international outrage. Now, what can the U.S. do to be a part of that? One thing I think is important, and fortunately we haven't heard too much of this potential mistake yet, is if we really care about the suffering of the Uyghurs, and the Kazakhs and the Kyrgyz in China, and the attempts to re-engineer their culture. And if we care about the spread of that kind of system, which we see occurring to other parts of China and the potential for it to spread to other parts of the world, if that's what we really care about, I think it's important to decouple this from geostrategic considerations. Because when we link this to geostrategic considerations about competition, great power competition between the US and China, that makes US and other rich world countries' outrage, moral outrage, look cynical to the partners that we need if we're going to develop the kind of global, united pushback that seems more likely to influence China's leadership. The other element of this, I don't want to suggest that America's voice is not important. It's not sufficient, but it is absolutely necessary. And what I think we need to see is a much stronger and more action-oriented response from the US. The Indonesian government is not going to stick its head up and be the most powerful voice on this issue. We need the US to come out strong, for example, at the very least, enacting Magnitsky sanctions, which the US has done for many other, in many other cases, including the Chinese government, and is strangely not actually pulling the trigger on now. This kind of action gives cover to the other kind of states to put up some resistance to the Chinese state, and I would like to see that very soon from the US government.
Great, thank you very much, Ryan. Dave.
Thanks, Eric. Thank you to Hudson for having me, and I'm honored to be on a panel with such esteemed experts, people that I've been listening to and learning from on this issue for a long time. There have been some excellent, of course, discussion of the horrors of what's happening to Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities in Xinjiang and also outside China's borders. I'll focus my remarks on some of the external ramifications, some of which have been addressed, but going a bit deeper into how Beijing's approach to defending its crimes in Xinjiang internationally is fundamentally bound up in its approach to shaping the world to fit the Chinese Communist Party's extreme actions, and also how it's using its increasing leverage around the world to influence countries and also international norms to do so. As Ryan noted, the party never responds particularly constructively to international pressure about its persecution of its own people, or at least it hasn't traditionally. It's always sought a propaganda or a superficial diplomatic response, and there's many examples of that. But now, despite these unprecedented horrors in Xinjiang finally getting attention, Beijing is perhaps more confident than ever, I would argue, in its growing power to use its leverage around the world to basically be impervious to international pushback on its actions in Xinjiang. And I think that they are even more confident that they can prevent those kinds of elements of pushback before they even emerge. So first I want to discuss a little bit how and why the party is using that growing power on this issue, focusing on Xinjiang's role in the Belt and Road Initiative and how that drives China's response to what's happening in Xinjiang externally, and the success that they're having in creating what is thus far, I would argue, an underwhelming reaction to the crisis. And then in particular look at how the CCP is doing this through its influence in individual countries and in multilateral bodies. And then close with a bit of a discussion about how this is really a key fundamental test of whether the international community is going to tacitly accept the party's inhumane behavior in an age where China really has unprecedented leverage around the world. So on the Belt and Road, as Senator Cotton noted, it's not inconsequential that China has undertaken these measures in Xinjiang at a time when the region is at the heart of the Belt and Road Initiative, Xi Jinping's signature foreign policy initiative, which is intended to benefit China not only strategically and economically, but also is meant actually to represent the promise of a rising China's contribution to the common destiny of mankind, as they've put it. The Belt and Road is, of course, supposed to help develop Xinjiang itself, linking it to its neighbors and ultimately to Europe. But it's also seen as a hub of the whole initiative by Beijing. For example, Chinese official press has trumpeted Xinjiang as the logistics hub of the BRI, noting things such as the train logistics center in Xinjiang, which started in 2016, but has already gone from only 4 international lines to now trains operating once per week to trains departing now on 19 lines covering 24 cities throughout Asia and Europe. China's trying to make the Urumqi an international airline hub as well, with the NDRC, that's China's main economic planning body, in November approving more than $8 billion in an airport expansion plan for that airport, with a goal by 2030 of having more than 60 million passengers a year going through that airport. We see Xinjiang in official media being regularly hyped as this hub that is going to drive what they do in Belt and Road elsewhere. The China Daily recently had a commentary of Xinjiang being noted as a crucial gateway, not only in the region with the 7 neighboring countries, but also with Europe and beyond. So there are big hopes that the party is placing on Xinjiang, I would argue, as the hub of BRI. This is despite the fact that China's current economic slowdown is disproportionately affecting Xinjiang, where fixed asset investment has been down by 1/4 year-on-year in December. And in the latest GDP target numbers came out, they slashed them down to 5.5% compared to what it was supposed to be 7%, making it one of the slowest growing regions in China. But as attention to what China's doing to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang builds, the party faces a problem, right? Because Beijing has to ensure that its propaganda line about the Belt and Road turning Xinjiang from a remote border region into a gate opening to the West, and as something that's promising for all of mankind and raising all boats and all of that. They want that to be the dominant narrative rather than Xinjiang representing the inhumanity at the heart of the Belt and Road and as its logistics hub. And this is at a moment when there's already significant pushback building on Chinese financing and business practices in many Belt and Road countries, where now we're having the camps in Xinjiang tied to the Belt and Road, and that could put the entire initiative, I would argue, in a very different light, very negative light, and give very different meanings to what China has promised, particularly, as has been noted, in the many Muslim countries in Asia that are central to the Belt and Road success. So given the leadership's focus on ensuring BRI's success and their apparent determination to continue their oppression in Xinjiang, as we've heard from others, the party, I would argue, is doubling down on its efforts to shape the international narrative about what's happening in Xinjiang and how China and the Belt and Road in particular will benefit Xinjiang and the world. In Muslim countries in particular, I think it's most notable that many of these countries that are critical to the success of Belt and Road and might be expected to strongly criticize what's happening to their fellow Muslims in the west of China have remained relatively muted in their reactions, as Doken and others have noted. And this is in the same countries where in the past we've seen widespread protests and public statements in support of human rights of Palestinians, Rohingya Muslims, but not much on what's happening in Xinjiang. The Global Times, one of China's nationalistic official press outlets, recently reported that China has passed a 5-year plan to Sinicize Islam to make it more compatible with Chinese socialism. This seems like the kind of thing that many of these Muslim countries would not ignore if it were not coming out of China. the lack of attention from Muslim majority states isn't out of ignorance. I would argue these governments know full well what's happening and they're not speaking out. And a big part of why they're not doing so is because of what they're getting out of Chinese investment through the Belt and Road. And because of that influence, I would argue, there's a sense of benefit. There's also an element of corruption and elite capture that's happening in these countries, especially, I would argue, in some of these countries bordering China and Central Asia and elsewhere. And these countries and their elites are benefiting from what China is bringing to those countries, and so they are quieting their populaces and they are unwilling to criticize. I think Tolkien noted Malaysia. There's some hope there, perhaps, about standing up to China more since the election of Prime Minister Mahathir. That might translate to human rights issues. The government recently let a group of Uyghur asylum seekers go to Turkey rather than deporting them to China. But I'd look at Pakistan's meager and shifting response to this issue as kind of an example of what China's influence can achieve. In September, Pakistan's religious affairs minister reportedly raised the treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang during a meeting with the Chinese ambassador, which was a positive sign, which of course later was denied. The Chinese embassy in Islamabad then invited a group of Uyghurs to meet with officials in a public relations stunt. And then Pakistan changed its tune. Imran Khan, the prime minister last month, said, I don't actually know much about the situation of Muslims in Xinjiang, and he wanted to discuss instead his country's economic partnership with China. And interestingly, this all occurred amidst a new pledge from China of $2 billion to shore up Pakistan's finances. And just late last month, a senior Pakistani diplomat offered up a staunch defense of China's actions, and that diplomat had in late December joined this guided tour that we've discussed in Xinjiang that Beijing organized for diplomats and journalists from 12 countries, Russia and a bunch of countries from Asia, most of them with large Muslim populations. Regardless of whether these sorts of visits actually convince anyone, I think they're meant to give an opening for countries like this where they are beholden to China to endorse China's position when they're already predisposed to do so because it's in their interests. Meanwhile, as Tolkien mentioned, the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, they've spoken out on Palestine, Yemen, the Rohingya crisis, but have remained mostly silent on what's happening to Uyghurs since 2009. Although they did note in December disturbing reports of a crackdown and hope that China would address the concerns of Muslims. These are issues that are likely to be on the agenda at the next OIC Council of Foreign Ministers in March. So perhaps there's some hope, but China is the largest trading partner of 20 of the 57 OIC countries. So I'm not terribly optimistic that we'll see a drastic change. We've discussed a bit the lack of action among Western governments up to recently. That does seem to be changing with, in part, US leadership. Recently, the camp issue, I think, has raised more awareness among Western governments, certainly, and the threat of real action seems to be affecting China's calculus. This is probably what has prompted a notable shift in China's PR strategy over the camps from silence to trying to get ahead of the story with an unapologetic defense based primarily on the supposed need to, of course, fight terrorism and set up vocational training and whatnot. And of course, we've had further PR stunts such as the EU delegation that was mentioned. I think a lot of these efforts, the visits, the PR efforts, they may seem kind of clumsy and we can try to laugh about them, but actually I think the point of what the party is doing is they're muddying the issue and then they're coming at it from various angles. On the one hand, they put out positive messaging about what China's doing in Xinjiang to confuse, and at the same time, they simultaneously use their growing international leverage to squelch critical discussion of China's repressive policies through first manipulating the narrative inside individual countries, and secondly, fundamentally trying to alter the approach to human rights in international forums. And so I want to address those two issues. First, in terms of manipulation of the narrative, in many autocratic or soft autocratic countries where leaders, again, are close to or often beholden to China, Beijing doesn't really actually have to do much to shape the narrative because those countries' leaders will do it for them. You see this in Cambodia. You could arguably see it in places that are not quite as extreme, in Serbia, for instance, where you have control over the media, you have elites benefiting from that relationship with China, and so they do China's dirty work for it. There's also evidence that there's a lot of media control training going on from China, and of course the export, which we've discussed, of surveillance and other tools that China is sharing with these countries. But even in democratic countries where there's more arguably a freer media environment, There are notable examples of China's growing leverage resulting in a desert of information on its actions in Xinjiang, largely as a result of China's growing economic investment in a lot of media enterprises. There are many examples, but probably the best one is from September when a South African journalist wrote an article about the persecution of Uyghurs for a South African newspaper, which among other topics discussed the inability of African leaders to question China on the issue. And then ironically, after writing this article, he very quickly had his column pulled. It's not a coincidence that 20% of that company, independent media, is held by 2 Chinese firms. This company is the second largest media company in South Africa, and a fifth of it is Chinese-owned, giving the firms immense decision-making power in the company and making sure that media outlets tell what Xi Jinping would call a good China story. This dynamic is happening in a lot of countries all around the world where Chinese government-tied entities are gaining leverage in countries' media spaces. The South African story, however, is an anomaly because it was so clumsily handled and then it was revealed later by the reporter. I would argue that China's investments in media, think tanks, academia, and other institutions around the world are being done very quietly, and they're growing, and there will be more quiet manipulation of the information environment to suit the party on the Xinjiang issue and many others, with little to no discussion in these countries about what's happening. That's something that we need to take very seriously. As China gets away with shaping countries' coverage and perceptions of its crimes from both above through cultivating elites and from below by shaping the information space, this bolsters the party's sense that it can whitewash or stifle discussion of almost any behavior that the party wants to take using its influence to ensure its actions are condoned, if not outright endorsed. Secondly, meanwhile, in the multilateral forums, and this has been touched on a little bit, but China is acting to shift scrutiny away from its actions in Xinjiang by defanging human rights protections and weakening norms against political and religious persecution. China is now the UN's second biggest donor. It's using some of that clout to quiet criticism on Xinjiang, among other things, to decrease the UN's ability to conduct oversight moving forward, and even to reduce UN posts dealing with human rights. They're proactively moving to get the Human Rights Council to stop naming and shaming human rights abusers, and they're promoting their interpretation of national sovereignty and non-interference in internal affairs to weaken human rights norms. And this reflects a much wider strategic approach that we've seen build under Xi Jinping to reshape global governance to fit the Chinese Communist Party and to condition acceptance of any action it might take at home or abroad to suit its interests. As has been noted, China recently underwent its third Universal Periodic Review, at which, as Ambassador Curry noted, the US and others did speak out, and that will result in a report to be released in March. So there's some hope around that. Chinese allies will defend it, of course, in that forum. It's likely that additional countries will refrain from criticizing China, and this will be kind of a good bellwether to look at how successful China has been in influencing these countries, particularly if countries that spoke out in 2013 do not speak out this time and criticize China on this issue. But I want to say in closing that this really is a key moment because China's success in managing the international community's response to its actions in Xinjiang will be a critical marker of things to come. The party judges that rather than being shaped by the international pushback on its heinous actions in Xinjiang and elsewhere, it can instead shape that very international response and prevent any action that causes it to change course. So the response to this crisis will go a long way to confirming or disproving that broader hypothesis. China's attempts to shape the world's response to its actions will only become more frequent, I would argue, because we increasingly have in China a bit of a paradox, a country where it's increasingly powerful and has a lot of leverage abroad that it intends to use, while domestically the party is increasingly paranoid and concerned that it will lose control as its economy slows. Xi Jinping just last month led a meeting, major meeting. They expected to have a plenum. Instead, they had this meeting on the risks to party control, where he told ministerial and provincial leaders the party is facing long-term and complex tests to maintaining long-term rule and told them to prepare for the worst. This is a toxic mix, and it's likely to lead to a much more aggressive approach on the party's behalf when it comes to repression in Xinjiang and more broadly in China as their paranoia grows and control becomes more brittle. And secondly, when it comes to using that growing external leverage to prevent criticism or even discussion about the party's inhumane actions and to neuter human rights mechanisms, particularly on issues such as Xinjiang, which, as I've noted, are tied up in the party's broader strategic goals, not to mention its attempt to portray itself as a responsible global power on the world stage. What China's doing in Xinjiang makes clearer than anything that what we're facing in the rise of China under the party is really an ideological contest with a regime not only willing to do anything to its citizens, but also willing to use its growing strength abroad to undermine the liberal order and to force tacit acceptance to whatever the party deems necessary. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Excellent. I want to be mindful of everybody's time, and we're running out of it. So let's go to Q&A. Let's take 10 minutes. If everybody can keep their questions very, very brief so we can try to pack in as much discussion as possible. We'll go to this gentleman in the front row first. You can identify yourself and your affiliation, and please, everybody, keep your questions as short as possible. Thank you.
Hi, is this on? Okay, my name is Michael Cole. I work with technology manufacturers, many of which are in China, and have spent some time in Western China as well. I have two questions, if that's all right. The first question is to build upon what Senator Cotton was talking about. He briefly mentioned things that we can do to change Chinese behavior, but then he didn't expand on it. So I wonder, Ambassador Curry in particular, not to put you on the spot, but I wonder what can be done with American policy to inflect Chinese behavior, Chinese government policy, without constraining commerce. And what I have in mind in particular is the Export Administration Regulations and the ITAR. What are some of the ways that we can use those policies to target these behaviors? The second thing, I've traveled a bit in Shanxi and Xinjiang and Qinghai provinces, and I've seen different kinds of things being done related to what you're talking about. So I was surprised that the other two provinces weren't mentioned at all today. Do you find any illuminating comparisons and contrasts between the ways that Tibetan Buddhists and Muslims are treated and the things that the Chinese government does in the Western provinces?
Thank you. Kelly, do you want to take that first question?
Yeah, I'll take the first one. A lot of these, the regulations that you refer to are primarily administered by the Commerce Department and the Treasury Department. So we have been working interagency with our partners at those departments and also in a very active dialogue with Congress, with interested members of Congress on what we need to be doing to ensure that U.S. producers and U.S. technologies are not being used as part of the apparatus of surveillance and repression in Xinjiang. And we've, as I mentioned in my remarks, been engaged in a very active dialogue with producers, with U.S. And even with Chinese companies to try to make them aware of the dangers of what happens with products in their supply chain and discourage them from engaging in activities that we think would help support the repressive apparatus. It's an interagency process, it's iterative and it's ongoing, but we do have a very active dialogue with the Hill in particular about whether the tools we have are adequate, what we need, and how to apply the tools that we do have. It is something we are actively discussing.
Thank you. There is a bill in the Congress sponsored by Senator Warner and Senator Rubio, which is attempting to set up an Office of Technology and Security at the White House, which is going to bring back, and I would suspect we're going to see a lot more of this, going to bring back a lot more stricter export controls to PRC, particularly on technologies that can be used to build up the surveillance state. And with respect to your second question, it's worth remembering that Governor Chen Chuanguo, who's now in charge of Xinjiang, he developed a lot of the techniques that are being implemented in Xinjiang when he was governor of Tibet. So there's plenty that's going on in the Western regions, and the Communist Party is learning from this experience. Sir, here in the third row. Yes, it's on its way.
My name's Alec McCrae with Media Development Associates. What do we know about the actual teaching and propaganda curriculum that's used within the concentration camps? Is it focused on religion, on the Muslim religion, or is it focused on Uyghur culture, or is it focused on both? And if it's focused on religion, is it designed to replace Islam with another religion, or is it designed to eradicate religion altogether and move over to atheism as the state belief of the PRC?
Yeah, I'll take that one. We don't know a lot of detail about the curriculum in the camps, but I would say generally that it seems like what they're forced to study, aside from the Chinese language, is sort of up-to-date propaganda, up-to-date ideology, Xi Jinping thought. We have reports of, alongside that though, of instruction in the Confucian three-character classic, which has been used to educate people in Confucian values for centuries. So this seems to be a and then to your question about religion per se, there are several people who have been in the camps have reported that they have been either forced to denounce Islam or to refrain from Islamic gestures and statements. So for example, we have more than one report of people being told that rather than saying, as people usually do at the beginning of a meal, Bismillah, in the name of God, that they should say some sort of greeting or thanks to Xi Jinping. So in some way, Xi Jinping is kind of replacing the religion, you might say. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Volkan, do you have a brief response
Yeah,
to that?
is actually in the camps and peoples have been faced for indoctrination, political indoctrination, and the brainwashing, also and self-criticism. You have to, and it's also and express loyalty to the Xi Jinping and the Communist Party. So, and there is also physical torture and the mental torture, both sides. And actually for the religious, of course, today there is not exist any religious freedom, any kind of the activities. Even you cannot say Salam Alaikum, even you cannot give the Muslim name your baby and then your baby. So actually this religious persecution not only for the Uyghur Muslim today, and all kind of Chinese Christian, Tibetan Buddhist, and Falun Gong, and the Uyghur Muslim, all has been targeted by the Chinese Communist Party.
There's a cult inside the party that can't countenance the existence of higher principles above it. Miss.
Thank you. I'm Jean Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. This question is to Ambassador Curry. At your level, what do you think we can do to suggest to President Trump at the coming meeting with President Xi, soon be coming? Would you put in a word, Ambassador Haley and Secretary Pompeo, put this on the table with President Trump? Because obviously this issue doesn't just include the human rights, but it also includes a lot of trade issue, balance of power with the Belt and Roads and everything else. But we most importantly worried about the Uyghurs. Over 2 million of them are being eliminated. And I must say that this also being applied to neighbors country, including Vietnam. We've seen a lot of it happen in Vietnam at a lesser degree, but China is using the same tactics everywhere else. So it's a big concern. Would you talk to our President Trump and Secretary Pompeo about that? Put that on the table.
Kelly, can you?
Well, respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, whether it's in China, Vietnam, any place, is a fundamental part of American foreign policy, and it's fundamental to who we are as a country and our values. And I think you heard last night during his State of the Union address, the president talk about who the United States is and what we are, and that we are a country based on freedom and on respect for fundamental human rights. It's part of our national character, and it is part of our foreign policy. We are constantly engaged in internal discussions about how and when we raise different issues in different forums, and that is just what we do every day. So, of course, this is part of our internal deliberations. I'm not going to speak to specific aspects of it, but I will say that we are raising our concerns with China about this issue all the time. And this is something that we do at all levels, all the time. This is not a one-off thing. So I'll just leave it at there.
Sir, here in the third row.
Thank you. My name is Dr. Akab Malik. I'm a Fulbright scholar currently at the Seeger Center, Elliott School. Just a brief question, or shall I say a critique maybe, partly, within the question. Decoupling geostrategic issues, as David's explained, is going to be pretty impossible given that the nations surrounding China, for example, especially in the Muslim environment, are very much interest-based, and they're really not going to criticize China because of the Belt and Road and the massive outreach that China's put through that. And given that the Belt and Road itself may well be, I'm writing about this, it may well be the key to their power projection and the change of global order. And that's what I want to get into as far as geostrategy is concerned, because given the conditions of the day at the moment and the potential change in global order, potential being if nobody else does anything, over the next 30 years more or less, then we could see something like this propagate itself throughout the world. Saying that as it is, how do you get these stories out? Because maybe I'm quite interested in this subject, so I know more about it than most people, but many people see this as hearsay. They don't see irrefutable evidence to persuade them. And that's actually what matters more than anything else, is that getting on the ground and producing that irrefutable evidence for maybe termed as a politically correct words, information dissemination campaign rather than PSYOPs, to propagate that, to change the narrative around. You're not going to get it any other way, really, I don't think.
Dave, do you have a brief response?
Well, I mean, I would agree with that. I think it's not an easy challenge. I think part of what has to happen is what happened here today with Ambassador Curry and my other fellow panelists listing out, just repeatedly what are the myths and what's actually happening there. But when it comes to countries where either because they're autocratic and they benefit from what China's bringing them and they don't want to have their populaces know about it, that's really hard to get around. What we're doing at IRI is actually trying to deal with some of the aspects of China's information manipulation or sharp power in developing democracies, to spread kind of an understanding of how China operates and how China exerts influence in a lot of these countries, and therefore to make sure that number one, people are aware of what China's doing in their country, and then giving them the tools to report about it and talk about it. And so I think, as I mentioned, this example in South Africa, that was unusual because it was something that came to light. But that sort of thing is happening all the time. And so I think, the goal number one is to really have more transparency and really to shine a light on what China's doing in a lot of these countries to quiet any sort of criticism about party behavior, whether it's in Xinjiang or elsewhere.
Let's take one final question. Miss here.
Joanne Young, the co-chair of the Republican National Lawyers Association. Historically, with racist authoritarian regimes, a precursor to this kind of persecution, even genocide, is a indoctrination of the population, the country's population, a misinformation campaign. And I'm wondering if you can comment on what the Chinese people have been told and what they know, realizing it's an authoritarian regime that sort of controls the media. But what, if anything, they understand about what's going on with the Uyghurs, and also whether there are any openings in the international community for, through the internet, through other means, to get the word out to them about what their government's doing.
Great question. Dolken, do you want to
Well, well, today, as I said, is before, and that this communication is not the issue for the world, but for us, it is not only what is going on in the camp, even we don't know really what's going on outside the camp as well. So all the media was censored and controlled by the CCP. All the media in China is a propaganda machine of the Chinese Communist Party. So, and the whole world knows very little information. Even I told, and I don't know what's going on in my family as well today. So, and today, and the Chinese government also, as I said, not only controls information between China and outside, even control the Uyghurs population in outside, targeting and the safety of the Uyghur on outside. So, and we have really little information on this. But however, it is already 2 million people in the camps, more than maybe 3 million people in the camp. It is the reality. So we need the world and United Nations should be sent some fact-find mission to the China, to the East Turkestan, to the region. And this is the only way to know, because recently Chinese government organized some diplomats, some foreign correspondent, just Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan as a country who support China all the time, and they're trying to open the some camp to visit this, just to cheating to the world. So that's why we discuss and we ask the US and the Western country and the Chinese government to allot some international independence media group and some independent investigation group to invest and to fact-finding in the region. Yeah.
Some of the party's rhetoric on Islam has emphasized that it's superstitious, that it's backward, that it's anti-modern, and that as a consequence of that, it's the source of splitism, as was mentioned earlier, a source potentially of rebellion and violence and of terrorism, which affects the rest of China. And this is the main discussion, I would say, from party outlets and organs about Islam as such in China today. And media is tightly controlled by the party state in PRC. So alternatives, we know that they've existed, but they have been increasingly pushed out